Hello and welcome to the Entertainment Gig Podcast and Music Edition, episode number 6. My name is Cleon. On this week's episode, we discuss money-making dead musicians, we review Banks' new album, we make the case for putting Chic into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and at the end there is a special announcement. Okay, let's just dive right into the news because there's an awful lot to get to this week for the first time in quite a while. News item number 1, which you may have missed, is that Rod Stewart was knighted by Prince William this past week, so you may now officially start calling him Sir Rod Stewart. Not quite sure if that gets you 2 for 1 at Denny's, but it's kind of cool to be called Sir at anything. The really big news for the past week was that Bob Dylan was actually awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. This is the first time that a musician has actually been awarded this prize I think he's the first one. Maybe the first one in quite some time. What they pointed out was obviously not his stellar singing performance. However, they pointed out his lyrics and how using poetry in music lyrics is now the norm. When he first started out back in the 60s, it was not, and that's why they gave him the award. It was kind of a shocker for a lot of people who were in the audience when they made the announcement. In fact, some people actually started laughing. Personally, I think it's well deserved. I mean, if you ever read or listen to Dylan's lyrics, they're classics, just absolute classics. As a matter of fact, the Spotify listening to his music actually went up 500% since the announcement was made. So that can only be good for everybody. In Get Well Better news, Tanya Tucker is recovering from a respiratory infection, so hope the country legend gets much better. Also, Pandora and Amazon have started on-demand streaming, which is different from their other streaming services in the fact that now they're really going to charge you for it. Amazon already does Prime streaming, but now they're going to do what is called Prime Unlimited for $8 a month. Their regular Prime streaming service got you 2 million songs that you could choose from regular Prime music. Now you get to choose from virtually everything, and apparently you can even do it offline, and it's $8 a month. For the Echo speakers, they're doing a special service where it's going to be $4 a month. Now, because of the fact that Pandora is starting to charge for an on-demand streaming service as well, their stock has gone down about 3% because analysts now say that there are way too many streaming services out there and Pandora's is not going to succeed. So I'm sure that'll help their self-confidence quite a bit. In other news, Kenny Rogers has announced that he is retiring from performing, and I can understand why. Guy's been around decades, actually close to 40 years, almost 50 years by now, actually. He's kind of getting up there in age, and he's decided that that's it. He's just not going to perform anymore. I have a funny feeling that the Gambler will be back, though, at least once in a great while to do a performance or two, just because once a performer, always a performer. And even if you're not going to go out on tour, you're at least going to show up for an award show every now and then. Also, Madonna was named Billboard Magazine's 2016 Woman of the Year. She beat out Beyonce, Taylor Swift, and Adele. It's not, however, because of her music sales, because her music sales were pretty much non-existent this year. It was actually because of her tour, which made $170 million. It ended in March, but this actually also extended her record for biggest female touring artist of all time at $1.311 billion in total concert gross, which once you pull out paying everybody, etc., I'm not quite sure how much money she would actually make off of that. But just in total concert gross, $1.311 billion all time. They also gave it to her because of her philanthropic efforts and a couple other things. And I guess, I don't know. Honestly, I would have given it to either Beyonce or Adele. Adele was the first woman to sell over 10 million copies of her last album in quite some time. You can't argue that point. And her tour made a lot of money. And it's whatever. Congratulations, Madonna, I guess. But that's about it. And now, because everybody else is talking politics, I'm going to talk politics just from the musical angle of it all. Issue number 1. Donald Trump apparently called Lil Jon and Uncle Tom. That has now been confirmed by Lil Jon. It happened on an episode of The Apprentice where they were doing an Uncle Sam promotion, and Donald jokingly called Lil Jon Uncle Tom. He and a few of the other contestants had to explain to Donald Trump why calling Lil Jon Uncle Tom was a bad thing. He never used the word again, so there's that. Also in political news having to do with the election this year, Franz Ferdinand has released Demagogue, which is about the person who we just talked about. And since we have to throw Hillary in here as well, J-Lo is apparently performing in Miami at a Hillary fundraiser, along with a lot of artists who have been performing for Hillary lately as well. So music and politics are always going to mix up. However, music and videos in politics are now becoming the thing. For instance, Danny Elfman has scored a Funny or Die video of Trump stalking Hillary during the second debate, which I've seen it, and it's hilarious the way he did it. Also, will.i.am of the Black Eyed Peas fame has also done a Funny or Die video where he gets to play Donald Trump, and it of course has to do with sexual harassment. So there's all that as far as the election goes, and that's it for all that election talk. Now, I normally don't do birthdays. However, this one's a big one, and it went basically unnoticed. Happy 90th birthday to one of the originators of rock and roll, Mr. Chuck Berry. And I bet you didn't even hear about that happening, but it happened. He's still kicking. Not sure if he's still performing, but happy 90th birthday to Chuck Berry. Okay, this week's topic is a not so fun one, but a fun one in a weird way. I'll explain. Forbes magazine came out this past week with their list of biggest dead celebrities in terms of how much money a celebrity's estate has made over the past year. And there were actually 3 musicians that made this list. The biggest one is the king of pop, Michael Jackson, who made, in the past year alone, $825 million. Let me repeat that. Michael Jackson, dead, made $825 million. Now, before you go crazy and say, well, why, there's no album that he came out with. Obviously, he wasn't touring this past year. So, how did he make his money? Simple. What he did was, the estate sold his stake in the Sony ATV music publishing catalog. That includes the rights to a lot of the Beatles songs. This was a catalog that ended, essentially, Michael Jackson's and Paul McCartney's friendship, because Paul McCartney had suggested to Michael way back in the mid-'80s, hey, you may want to consider buying catalogs from artists who no longer have control over their music. So Michael wisely but very shrewdly bought the Beatles catalog. How John Lennon and Paul McCartney lost the catalog is up for another time. But like I always tell everybody, own your music. That's all I'm going to say on that issue. In any event, they basically sold, the estate did, sold the Sony ATV music publishing catalog, and they sold it back to Sony themselves. So now Sony owns the Beatles songs, which is weird, but whatever. Oh, I forgot to mention, they sold it for $750 million. That's a huge chunk of profit, since he basically bought the entire catalog for about $1 billion, or $1 million actually, way back in the mid-'80s. So it went from $1 million to $750 million. Good return on investment. So that's how he made $825 million last year. The other $75 million made for licensing, etc., etc., etc. You may wonder, who was the second biggest artist? Regrettably, it was Prince. Or actually, no, I take that back. It was Elvis Presley, who made $27 million last year. Prince was actually third, but just behind him at $25 million. And if you're wondering where David Bowie ended up on the list, he was 10th. He made $10 million, or $10.5 million actually, according to Forbes magazine. A lot of that having to do with the last album that he put out just after, or just before he passed away. In case you're wondering who the top 5 celebrities of last year were, well, you had Michael Jackson at number 1. Charles Schultz, from Peanuts fame, Snoopy, Charlie Brown, and all that, made $48 million last year due to all the licensing that the Snoopy characters and whatnot have. Arnold Palmer, who just recently passed away, made $40 million just in licensing and endorsement deals for his iced tea, his lemonade drink, his leisure wear, his golf course designs, all that sort of stuff. And then rounding out the top 5 is Elvis Presley and Prince. My favorite part of the entire article is the following lines, where they're talking about how Forbes estimates were based on pre-tax income before management and legal expenses. The figures were compiled through interviews with estate experts and data on record sales, touring, and movie earnings. It was the touring part that I thought was rather funny, because who knew that Prince was still touring even after death? I can't wait for him to roll into good old New York City. This week, I make the case for putting Chic into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, as we all know ad nauseum by now, if you are a performer, in order to be eligible for the Rock Hall, you have to have had your album out, your first one, by a major record label at least 25 years ago. Chic definitely has that. They were one of the biggest disco groups back in the 70s into the early 80s. The reason why they should be put in is twofold. One, they were extremely influential. They basically brought R&B into disco. They also had a couple of members, actually a few members, who went on to do other things that were extremely influential. Let's start with the big one, Nile Rodgers. Nile Rodgers is one of the biggest producers out there and has been since the 70s. He produced for David Bowie, Let's Dance. That album, he produced a few songs off of that went on to be huge hits, Let's Dance being the big one. Also, Debbie Harry, he produced her first album. In fact, Debbie Harry actually credits Chic for Rapture, which was a tribute to Chic's Good Times, but we'll discuss that song later, because that song has its own life, basically. Recently, Nile Rodgers also helped to produce the song Get Lucky, the one that won for Song of the Year with Daft Punk and Pharrell Williams from a couple years ago. So Nile Rodgers has been going strong since the 70s and still doing it. That alone should get them in. However, there is also Bernard Edwards, who was the bassist for Chic. His bass lines alone, any bass player will tell you, if they were into R&B or dance music or something along those lines, or even pop music, not so much rock, but it's his bass lines that influence them into even picking up a bass to begin with. John Taylor from Duran Duran, who went on to play with one of Chic's members, Mr. Tony Thompson, who in the band Power Station, that also had Andy Taylor from Duran Duran and also Robert Palmer on vocals. John Taylor credits Bernard Edwards and the song Good Times, that bass line alone, into getting John Taylor to pick up a bass and learn how to play it. A lot of artists started out that way just by listening to that song alone. That song's influence is basically worldwide and decades old. Sugar Hill Gang with Rapper's Delight, which was the first top 10 rap song on the pop charts. Basically, the entire riff is Good Times from Chic. Queen's Another One Bites the Dust was also influenced heavily by Chic. Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel was heavily influenced by Chic. Tony Thompson, like I said, played for Power Station, which was a huge group for a few years back in the 80s. All of that alone would make you think that Chic would get in. They had a bunch of hits on their own. You should check out the Greatest Hits album. They've actually been nominated 10 times to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Their last nomination was in 2014. They were not nominated this past year. they should be. They should automatically be in at this point. And if you're already putting in the Bee Gees, who are arguably the biggest group of all time in terms of the disco era, and you put in Donna Summer, you would think that Chic would be an automatic shoo-in. But it's taken over 10 years. They're still not in, and they deserve to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and hopefully that'll happen this year. Okay, quick hit album review time. This week we're going to quickly review Banks's The Altar. And Banks is what I like to call blue-eyed R&B dance. But it's a lot more R&B and less pop than Britney Spears, who she on occasions gets compared to. But definitely a lot harder on the R&B than the pop stuff. But she has 13 songs that are very popsy or trip hop, that some people call it alternative R&B, like The Weeknd, who she's actually opened up with on tour a couple of times now. The woman has talent. She's not a girl. She's 28 years old. She's been at it a little while, but this is her second album, actually. I recommend that you get it. It's an automatic buy. If you are into The Weeknd or Maxwell or Erykah Badu or anything that's more considered alternative R&B than just your straight up, I don't even know who is R&B these days, or even if it exists anymore per se as its own genre. But if you're into The Weeknd and that sort of style, you should definitely pick up this album. If you want to just try out a few songs, I would recommend Gemini Feed, Lovesick, Weaker Girl, Judas, Fuck With Myself, 27 Hours, Mind Games, or Better, which was her first big hit off this album. So by a basic bottom line, I would automatically get Banks's The Altar. Okay, record store time. This week's new releases are Gord Downie, new one from David Crosby, Jimmy Eat World, Korn, Lady Gaga, Leonard Cohen, which is an automatic must search out and listen to. Good recommendation. Ronnie Dunn, The Pretenders, and The Radio Department. As far as the 99-cent bin goes for Google Play, this week you can get Coheed and Cambria's The Color Before Sun, Everclear's Black is the New Black, Highly Suspect with Mr. Asylum, Hinder, When the Smoke Clears, Party Next Door with Party Next Door, and The Zombies with Still Got That Hunger. Each one 99 cents. Not a bad deal if you want to go and deep dive into a few albums from some older artists. Now, as far as Prime goes, because of the fact that Prime Music on Amazon is now split up between regular Prime, which, like I said before, has 2 million songs, and Prime Unlimited, which has a bunch of stuff, I have noticed this week that the newer albums are not going as much on regular Prime Music service, and they seem to be swinging them more towards the Prime Unlimited. Be that as it may, if you would like to check out Norah Jones's new album, the new one from Kings of Leon, and also the new one from Alter Bridge, those three are on the Prime Music membership that if you have regular Amazon Prime, you already paid for it. So there's three that you can definitely check out. And last but not least, as far as the record store goes, this week's Earworms are 3 singles that should be listened to, I think. Lady Gaga has a new one called Million Reasons. The Killers are back with Peace of Mind. I can't wait to get that album. Love that group. Also on the R&B, Mary J. Blige is back. New song called Thick of It, which is definitely a must listen to. Those are my 3 earworms for this week. Now, for that announcement. Here's the deal. For about a month or so, I had stopped doing interviews, in case you had been listening for a while on this. The main reason was really due to time issues. It just got too much going on with other projects and whatnot, so I had completely stopped doing them for a while. However, for the past few weeks now, I've kind of been toying with this idea of not only going back to doing the interviews, but also to expand out this podcast and maybe even torture myself by doing more podcasts and different ones. What I would really like to do is a podcast that concentrates on the music scene from, I would call it, or some people call it, the intelligence corridor, the I-95 route from Washington, D.C. all the way up to Boston, including New York, Philly, Baltimore, etc. I'm not sure if it's going to be a separate podcast, and I'm not quite sure about the format, as of yet at least, or if this is going to be in addition to the podcast that you normally listen to. Still not sure how that's going to work out. As far as the format goes, I figured it should have album reviews of independent bands, hopefully interviews, maybe some club reviews, and also some touring plugs thrown in. And I'm hoping eventually, not immediately, but eventually, that this actually becomes a video podcast as well. So, if you know any bands who want to be interviewed, or if they have club dates or albums that you want plugged or that they want plugged, just let me know by emailing me at cjbtproductions@gmail.com. Again, that's cjbtproductions@gmail.com. I'm also toying with the idea of doing a sports podcast, a political podcast, social justice podcast, science podcast, space industry podcast, and a geek podcast. For some godforsaken reason, I don't know why, except that I love doing podcasts, and these are my interests, and I don't know. We shall see. In any event, definitely going to do the podcast concerning the independent scene from DC up to Boston, so feel free to contribute to that. I will listen to and plug pretty much anything and everything at this point. And that is it as far as this week's episode goes. Here comes the earlier version of myself to give you all that lovely promotional legalese, blah, 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 blah. Everybody enjoy this week, and we will definitely talk to you next week. That is it for this week's episode. Our website is theentertainmentgig.com. Our Facebook page is at The Entertainment Gig. We are on iTunes and Google Play at The Entertainment Gig, but we are also on SoundCloud at CJBT-Productions and on YouTube at CJBT Productions, which has a slideshow of my photography, which you can find on Facebook at CJBT Photography, and the portfolio at cjbtproductions.zenfolio, that's zenfolio.com. And that is it. We will talk with you next week. Take care.